In this video, I'll be sharing some perspectives on Romans chapter 11. This video is for the Romans class at Hope Sound Bible College. In verses 1 through 5 of Romans chapter 11, Paul is discussing God's dealings with the nation of Israel. He has already soundly refuted the idea that ethnicity has anything to do with individuals standing before God. He's refuted the idea that ethnicity plays any role whatsoever in obtaining God's righteousness, which is the theme of Romans. So now he answers his anticipated critics, as Paul is prone to do throughout Romans. So imagining what a critic might say about what he's just said, and he gives a response. Paul imagines his critics saying, "So what about all these promises to Israel? Has God cast away his people forever? Is his promises, are they of no effect anymore?" And obviously Paul says the answer here is no. Paul says God is not failing to keep his promises to Israel. First off, we've got to go back and remember that Paul has already mentioned that not everyone who is Jewish is spiritually a descendant of Abraham. Not everyone who is ethnically Jewish or of the circumcision is necessarily spiritually Israel. The church is spiritually Israel. But Paul also points out here that God is being faithful. He's just. He says God has a remnant. Paul points out that even he himself is of the tribe of Benjamin. Paul is an ethnic Jew, though he was a Hellenistic Jew that took a Roman name, had Roman citizenship. Paul was still ethnically a Jew. He was a very religious Jew. So Paul says God has not cast off all his people. There's a remnant. He takes us back to the story of Elijah, when Elijah is fleeing from Jezebel, and Ahab is afraid for his life. When Elijah begins to pray to God and say that he's the only one left, God reminds Elijah that he has a remnant. We see this multiple times throughout Israel's history, even in the exile. It looks like during the Babylonian captivity, those several years there where they were the majority of ethnic Jews were out of the promised land that God had promised to their ancestor Abraham, that he would have them as a nation in the land. It looks like, in a sense, we could say at that time period in history with a limited perspective, we could say, has God forgotten his promise to his people? But in that case as well, God has a remnant. There are those who are righteous among the nation of Israel, even in the midst of their rebellion and idolatry. And Paul says it's the same in his day. God still has a remnant of ethnic Jews that are still believing on him. These are physically and in the natural, they are descendants of Abraham, but spiritually they're descendants of Abraham as well. These are what we would call today Messianic Jews, those Jews who are doing the works of Abraham and believing on Jesus Christ. And Paul also points out in verses 6 through 7, once again, this is what he's dealing with so much throughout the epistle to the Romans, but he says that righteousness is not obtained through the law. It's not by works that individuals will attain the righteousness of God any more than it is through ethnicity. Though Israel sought it through the works of the law, and it came unexpectedly to the Gentiles, there's not any injustice with God. Paul is defending God in this portion of the letter. There's no injustice here with God, even though things are not going as one would think for the nation of Israel and those people who are ethnically descendants of Abraham. Paul moves on and he begins to describe what I would call God's goodness in judgment. Some of the more difficult passages in Romans deal with the hardening of hearts and the predestination of those that it mentions, and here it's described as a blindness. This blindness has come. But in spite of this blindness, we see that God is working, that he might have mercy upon all, as Paul states here. God is working, and he's reaching out to the Gentile people. In a sense, it looks to some like what Paul is saying is that God is turning away from his people Israel. But Paul says no, God is still working to turn all this to salvation for individuals. If you remember the story of Joseph, God uses a multitude of sinful actions and sinful motives to accomplish the fulfillment of what he has promised and foretold to Joseph. He uses the hatred of his brothers. He uses even the seduction of Potiphar's wife. All these circumstances work together to bring Joseph to the place where God does fulfill what he has promised in the life of Joseph. Paul's looking ahead and he's saying that God is doing something here that's going to result in mercy. Even this blindness, this temporary blindness that's come, is going to end up back at mercy, so that God is not being unjust in any way here. Rather, God is being above and beyond merciful to his people Israel. God is working to redeem fallen humanity, both inside and outside ethnic Israel. And he's using a multitude of circumstances to do so. Even the hardening of the Jewish nation against Jesus Christ and his church, God's using all this to bring about the redemption of souls. Verses 34 and 36 really should bring humility to all of our minds and hearts as we approach these deep theological themes in Romans. There's so many controversies, so many battle lines that can be drawn doctrinally, and we pick a side and line up and destroy the other side. But really, verses 34 through 36 should serve to bring an attitude of humility in all our hearts and show us that we may not have all the answers. In fact, we don't have all the answers, because who can know the mind of God? His ways are unsearchable. They're past finding out. It should inspire worship, not a desire to be critical towards our theological opponents, or at least as we may perceive them. So a couple of perspectives I want to end with here. There are a lot of theologians who build some heavy soteriological assertions based on the previous chapters here in Romans, chapters 8 and 9, specifically about personal salvation. But it's important for us to keep in mind as we look at these passages, Paul did not necessarily set out with the intention to teach us about the mechanics of how predestination works in regards to our personal salvation, at least not nearly as much as he intends to talk in these passages about God's dealing with Israel and the Gentiles. Remember, God is dealing with people groups here, not just individuals. The big controversies that Paul is addressing is not issues. They are not issues of personal salvation as much as they are questions about how God is dealing with people groups. So that really brings us some important perspectives. We should be cautious in building a lot of heavy assertions about soteriology from these passages, even though there are some important soteriological implications in regards to our personal salvation. Keep in mind, Paul is dealing with the big picture here with the hardening of Israel and the extension of grace to the Gentiles. These issues are relevant to our salvation, but we ought to be cautious in how we handle these passages in light of that. Towards the end of chapter 11, Paul also deals with the final salvation of Israel. And sometimes we could have a tendency to overreact to errors. There are some within the dispensational camps that have made much of Israel, ethnic Israel, so much to the point that some, in response to some of these more reckless stances that have been taken, almost want to write off completely God's future dealings with Israel. But Paul here seems to speak of some future for ethnic Israel as a whole, as it relates to God's dealings with them in personal salvation for individuals within ethnic Israel. I've really enjoyed looking at Romans chapter 11. It's spoken to me personally. I think we see the vindication of God here from some of the potential critics of what God is doing at this time in history. I think we see a validation of the idea that God has given us free will and we are responsible to make wise decisions based on the revelation that He has given us. And we also have to look at what God has done with humility, recognize that God is much bigger than we are, and He sees things with a far greater wisdom than what we can understand. Thank you.